Hello, fiendlings, how the hell are ya? I'm currently dealing with some family medical stuff, so I'll keep this damn short. Essentially, my life is turning into a bad country and western song. Well, that's unfair. There's really no such thing as a good country western song. Oh, am I gonna get shit for that? Be that as it may, this month has seen me total my car, my entire family get COVID, including me, and multiple trips to the ER. That's just this month, and it ain't even over yet. Needless to say, things are a little effed up in my world right now as far as getting things done, so yeah, nothing more to report. Regardless of how crazy things are, for me, I have content to give to you. So, be safe, have a great week, and we'll talk again real soon. Here's episode 6 of The Black.
Chapter 4. The large lab table was packed with cores. 9 35-foot cylinders. Each core had been carefully raised from the drill string via wire line and brought to her for analysis. And the analysis was terrifying. The rock in the first 25 meters was as expected. The usual granite, igneous, and sedimentary layers were stacked atop each other in a gentle gradient of colors. But the last 5? They were the oddest damn thing she'd ever seen. It looked like rock, but it was, well, spongy. She hadn't yet identified what it was, and without more powerful equipment, it would be nearly impossible to tell. If they hadn't struck the pressurized pocket of liquid, she would have been going over the entire core for the next 2 days. As it was, she needed to focus on the actual liquid. That's what Calhoun and PPE wanted to hear about. Calhoun visited twice, and both times she told him to get the hell out. She didn't like people hovering over her while she worked. That went double for Calhoun. She knew he was excited to see what they'd brought up from the well, but he could wait until she had some definitive answers. With that in mind, a beaker of black liquid sat atop the steel table. She'd already taken a few drops and run them through a gas chromatograph. When she'd looked through the readings, her breath had stopped and her white teeth flashed in a large grin. She fought the urge to call in Calhoun. He was going to freak out when she saw what she had. But until she finished studying the oil beneath the microscope, she wasn't going to get his hopes up. The chromatograph was simply the first step in the process. The mud log report had indicated the liquid was oil, but it was impossible to simply look at the mud and know you had anything more than that. She needed to determine the sweetness of the crude. Rigs didn't have large labs. They didn't need them. Exploration rigs tended to have better facilities, but they were still too small to do precise analysis. Exploratory wells were just that. If the samples from a core looked good, then the drill would drop the bit through the drill string back down to the spud and bring up enough oil to fill a small barrel. 4 gallons was all that was needed. Because of the anomalous geology of the drill site, Leaguer had more than enough oil to ship out to Houston for in-depth study. Proper petrochemical labs usually take a week or 2 to complete any kind of serious analysis, but PPE had already paid for expedited service. When the barrel arrived at its destination, the lab would drop everything and analyze the molecular structure and provide a chemical breakdown. The report would be forwarded to PPE and Calhoun's team. Before email, it could take up to a month for a finished report to reach the field. By then, an exploratory rig would have punched at least 3 more test wells and shipped their contents to the same lab. Since the rig had satellite communications, the moment the chemists in Houston did their jobs, the results would be transmitted to Leaguer. But that was still at least a few days away. The sample had to be taken off the rig by helicopter or ship and then flown all the way to the lab. Technology might have made information gathering near instantaneous, but it had yet to create a teleporter. That meant her analysis was all they'd have to go on. She checked the digital timer on the desk and then stared up at the oil. Particles floated on top of the thick, dark liquid. Looking at the black wasn't going to be enough. She needed to figure out what those particles were. Shauna rose from her chair and stretched. Between taking apart the cores and setting up the equipment, she hadn't left the lab in nearly 7 hours. Her stomach was growling. Starved carnivore. Unlike catfish, she didn't have a cache of snacks. When you were working with chemicals, having food or drink around was a bad idea. She grabbed the thermometer lead and placed it in the beaker. The digital readout immediately jumped to 75 degrees. She smiled and removed the lead. Time for the fun, she thought. A gleaming gravity stand composed of a series of funnels and filters sat on one of the large tables. She used a pair of large forceps to pick up the beaker. As carefully as she could, she walked to the gravity stand and slowly poured the liquid into the first funnel. Shauna might not have a degree in chemistry, but part of her focus had been on petrosciences. That meant studying chemistry, and a lot of it. Calhoun had no doubt hired her all those years ago for more than just geology. Like this, for instance. She could separate the oil, measure its gravity, and analyze enough of it to determine if the crude was acceptable for the refining operations their employer had in mind. All oil was commercial, so to speak, but heavy oil or reserves that had a high concentration of water were more difficult to refine. With the continual rise in the price of oil, however, more and more companies were interested in the heavier and nastier stuff. Refining heavy oil was more expensive, but if the price was high enough, it was worth it. She stepped away from the stand and pulled off her gloves. They were heat-resistant and protected her from any kind of chemical residues left by the mud. If that stuff got on your skin, it was bad news. A rash was the best-case scenario. Third-degree burns were common when the chemicals were mishandled. The liquid burbled from one stage of filters to another. She watched the dark liquid as it flowed through the clear glass tubes. Its color was changing. After the second filter, it was no longer jet black, but a sweet mocha brown. Shauna grinned. A few more minutes passed and the liquid poured into the return beaker. Her smile widened. After passing through the filters to remove the mud fluid, the oil was a healthy amber instead of midnight black. Shauna stifled a yawn as she waited for the dripping to stop. With a sigh, she pulled on the heavy gloves and took the beaker she'd originally had the oil in and placed it beneath the gravity stand spigot. Any remaining oil in the system would drip harmlessly into the already contaminated beaker. She took the beaker with the filtered oil to a clear table against the wall. First, let's take a picture, she thought. She moved a small box in front of the glassware. Her fingers adjusted knobs on the box as she peered through a viewfinder, and once the beaker was completely in view, she pressed a button. The box clicked. She smiled at it, pulled an SD card from its side and slid it into her pocket. Once that was done, she returned the box to its spot on the table. A hydrometer and several other measuring tools were in an organized tray with labels. She fought the urge to roll her eyes. Evidently, PPE wanted to make sure its personnel knew what each instrument was, although why any of the drilling crew would be using a hydrometer was beyond her. She picked up the tool and ran her gloved fingers over the heavy glass instrument. It was bulbous at the end and relatively thin up top. A digital screen stared at her from the end in her hands. She slowly lowered the bulbous end into the liquid and waited. The hydrometer's digital readout blinked as it measured the sample's water content. She didn't manage to choke off the next yawn, and the sound echoed in the relatively small lab. After a moment, the digital readout went blank. She cocked an eyebrow at it, and then a series of numbers replaced the empty space. No fucking way, she said aloud. Water content was commonly found in samples, very common. Therefore, a bit of guesswork was involved in interpreting the results of any tests. But this made no sense. 10 ppm, she said aloud. That just couldn't be. Oil always had water in it, period. That was the rule. Oil was viscous and lighter than water. It floated atop any moisture that seeped out of the rock or sand. But this was impossible. She removed the instrument and quickly cleaned it using the chemical bath sitting in the nearby sink. She set it aside to dry and stared at the beaker. She wasn't sure she wanted to tell Calhoun about this. He wouldn't believe it. The black liquid defied the rules of geology and of oil itself. Where was the water? There had to be more to this. As she watched the beaker, she noticed a tiny air bubble pop to the surface. Her mouth opened and then closed. Air bubbles? In oil? Her heart beat fast in her chest. She didn't know why she was suddenly so afraid of what was in the beaker, but she was. The reptilian part of her brain was telling her to leave the room and leave now. In the past, Shauna had obeyed that ancient holdover from evolution, but not this time. Instead, she walked to the stand next to the specimen table and grabbed a filtration mask off a hook. With her hair tied back, she was able to put the mask on and tighten the straps without too much pinching. She kept her eyes on the beaker as her fingers felt for the tabs on the straps. Once it was secure, she felt better, but not as good as she felt when she put on the safety glasses. She should have put them on in the very beginning. It was, after all, procedure. But she was always careful. Now she was scared and wanted a biohazard suit. Hands shaking as she approached the beaker, she forced herself to calm down. "It's just oil," she told herself. "Maybe a little odd, but it's just a fucking collection of hydrocarbons. Get over it." But that reptile part of the brain wouldn't stop screaming at her. Once her hand steadied, she picked up the beaker using forceps and carried it to the small centrifuge in the corner. It was filled with test tubes. She grabbed a small glass funnel and placed it inside the mouth of the closest tube. Using the forceps, she lifted the beaker inch by inch until the amber liquid poured out. When the tube was little more than half full, she righted the beaker and placed it back on the table. Her deft fingers arranged the other tubes to counterbalance the sample's weight. If you didn't do that, the centrifuge would wobble and possibly break the glassware. She put a top on the tube and then pushed the hood down over the apparatus. She swiveled the knobs to 2K revolutions per minute, set the timer for 2 minutes, and started the machine. It whirred and spun. The noise wasn't uncomfortable, but it was loud enough to obscure quieter sounds. She didn't hear the burbling and bubbling inside the gravity stand, nor did she see more air bubbles pop inside the beaker. Shauna waited while the centrifuge did its work. Her stomach continued its insistent grumble, and she continued to ignore it. She could feed herself once the centrifuge was done. "Just a couple of more tests," she told it. Her stomach didn't care. While the seconds ticked down, she stared over at the LCD display hanging from the east wall. The screen was split into 4 equal sections. In the upper right, a camera view of the rig deck showed the men inspecting the pipe stands. Next to it was a view of the ocean waves. They were a little choppy today. The lower screens had a satellite view of the ocean weather report. She didn't like the look of that storm to the south. When they'd barreled through it on the supply ship, it had been a severe annoyance, but not hazardous. 48 hours later, it seemed to have grown. No mention of tropical storm winds, yet. The centrifuge engine ceased its growling and the whir slowly dissipated as it spun back down. The digital timer beeped twice. She turned back to look at the machine and sighed. As she reached the centrifuge, the loud hum of the air conditioner stopped. She guessed the thermostat was happy with the temp. She put her gloved fingers on the edge of the centrifuge hood and then stopped. It was barely audible, but something was crackling. She looked around the room for the source, but only saw the test equipment. It sounded like acid chewing through something. She stared at the decanters on the back wall. The liquids were still in their beakers, deathly silent and inert. The noise stopped. Shauna took one last look around and then focused her attention on the centrifuge. Stifling another yawn, she lifted the hood and stared down at the test tube. She carefully unlocked it from the compartment and squeezed on the removal tool. The metal forks slid past one another and created a gap larger than the cylindrical Pyrex specimen. She released the pressure and the grips locked around the glass. She lifted it up into the light. The oil was an even deeper shade of amber than before. She stared at the bottom. There were no particulates. There was no stratification. The oil was absolutely free of sediment. That wasn't right. At all. Oil always had water. Oil always had sediment. Crude was never just crude. A bubble popped inside the test tube. She jumped, the tool still in her hands. The liquid tried to slosh out of the glass but didn't. Her heart thumped in her chest and blood pounded in her ears. Treating the test tube like an explosive, she walked to the west wall and placed it in a test stand. She squeezed the tool and the tube slipped into an open slot. She stepped away from it. Searing halogen light blazed down from lamps above the tube stand. Another bubble popped from the tube, then another and another. The oil sizzled as though carbonated. She walked backwards, eyes riveted on the sight. What is this shit? She was afraid to go near it. Shauna looked around the lab. A metal tray hung from the wall. It was too big, but it would have to do. She pulled it from the wall and placed it atop the tube stand. The metal covered it fine, but looked as though it might slide off the stand. Shauna walked to the lab's hatch. She stripped out of her safety gear and threw it to the floor. She wasn't coming back to the lab. Ever. Her fingers found the hatch handle and she opened it. Eyes still fixed on the metal tray, she stepped backward into the hall and slammed the hatch shut behind her. The crew had stowed the pipes. The crew was cleaning out the mud traps. The crew, his crew, was kicking ass. Vrabel was happy. Once the drill string had been brought up, he'd hand it over the bridge. He'd been awake for 20 hours and it was time to sleep. Although he was the rig chief, he was supposed to work the same 12-hour shifts as his crew. That was company policy. For the first few days of drilling, Vrabel always found it impossible to rest. The bridge was where he wanted to be to handle any emergencies. His former boss had told him that he had to learn to let go and trust those he hired, which is why he spent so much time finding the best people possible. But as far as letting it go, that was still a work in progress. Down in the lab, Shauna would be examining the drill core and analyzing the liquids they'd pulled up. Gomez was going over inventory reports and inspecting the equipment. His men, those that were on duty, would be doing the same. Any anomaly, no matter how small, was to be reported immediately. Vrabel had made that clear to the men over and over again. All it took was one drill string section with a crack or metal fatigue to destroy an entire drilling operation. Pressure, mud, the actual rotation of the drill bit. All those different variables put a lot of stress on the steel pipe sections. Each of the 600-plus tubes had to be inspected and re-inspected after every drilling event. Production rigs carried a large number of spares. Sections on the drill string would eventually weaken and have to be replaced. A small exploratory rig like Leaguer, not as many spares as he'd like, but they could always get more from the supply ship. And if they had to wait a week or two to get them, tough shit. PPE would wait. The operation could wait. Companies like BP didn't perform their due diligence and people died as a result. Vrabel wasn't ever going to let that happen, regardless of the deregulation Congress constantly pushed through. The lobbyists could go fuck themselves. This wasn't just a business. People's lives were at stake. He blew steam off his coffee. The sun was high in the sky, but obscured by fluffy clouds. He'd checked the weather from his stateroom the moment he'd regained consciousness. The storm that had been cycling near the coast was still there and pounding the outer islands, but was no threat to them. Yet. Every hour the storm existed was another hour for it to shift and drift toward them. If the waves rose high enough, the relatively small rig would start moving around. Rigs were built to survive that kind of turmoil, but undersea volcanic activity or hurricanes had a habit of damaging them. Leaguer, built with the latest safety and semi-submersible technology, was capable of surviving 50-foot waves. Beyond that, who could say? He tapped the keyboard on his console and pulled up reports. Gomez and his men were reading the RFID tags on the pipe inspection apps and putting in data. Vrabel remembered when all this was done with paper and pen, and damn, but that was messy. Thankfully, technology had made the process a lot easier. But every report had to be checked. The human capacity for mistakes would always exist. Gomez had marked a pipe section as suspect and put it aside. According to the inventory, he'd already had a replacement pulled and re-inspected. They had 99 spares now. Vrabel wondered how many they'd have by day's end. An email alert popped up on his screen. He read the summary and sighed. It was from Executive VP Simmons. He clicked the mouse and the email filled the screen. He read it and sipped more coffee. Simpson had gotten his message regarding the first test well and wanted Shauna's report as soon as she was done. Micromanagitis, he said to the empty bridge. Of course he'd send the goddamn reports when they were done. What did the asshole think Vrabel would do? Sit on them? The exec also wanted to know when they were going to send the samples to Houston. As soon as possible, he said aloud and drank the rest of his coffee. Fighting the urge to send a flame mail to the big boss, he clicked reply and started crafting something more diplomatic. It'll be done when it's fucking done, was not an appropriate response, no matter how badly he wanted to write it. When he finished the email and clicked send, he leaned back in his chair and tried to calm himself. Between Calhoun's team and Simpson breathing down his neck, he was going to get an ulcer. "Gomez the chief," the radio growled. Glad for the distraction, any distraction, he pulled the mic from the clip. "Chief here. Over." There was a slight pause. "The team has finished the reports on the mud trap and recycle. We have another 200 pipes to inspect. Over." Vrabel nodded to himself. "I'll check out the reports on the mud. Take your time on the pipes and be sure. Over." "Understood. Over and out." He put the mic back on the clip. Gomez was a good man. Vrabel was damned glad he'd found him. It had required a hell of a job offer from PPE to get him off contract, but Gomez had agreed to come work as an actual employee. The oil biz was a mess. Job jumping was a constant threat even with lower-paid workers. For the best people in the industry, it was even more dire. PPE knew that. That's why they made sure their people were highly paid and well taken care of. That included benefits, stock options, bonuses, paid vacation, you name it. Although they were technically hourly employees, they might as well be on salary. Vrabel stood from his chair and headed back to the coffee machine. He slotted a pod, put the mug beneath the machine, and pressed the button. The machine hummed as it turned water into steam and spewed it through the grounds. The smell was glorious. His doctor had told him drinking so much coffee was hell on his kidneys, but Vrabel had never had a problem. And without coffee, man, he'd just ceased to function. There was a knock on the closed hatch. Vrabel looked toward the door and cocked an eyebrow. "Come in," he drawled. The hatch opened and Calhoun walked in. The older man was dressed in a pair of heavy khakis and a dark blue PPE work shirt. Sweat had already blossomed beneath his armpits. The rig might be air-conditioned, but that didn't seem to assuage the heat. Not for Calhoun, anyway. "Morning," Calhoun said. Vrabel smiled and looked at the dive watch on his wrist. "Morning? I think it's afternoon." The engineer grinned. "Well, it's always morning somewhere." Vrabel rolled his eyes. "Right." He nodded to the coffee machine. "Want an espresso or something?" Calhoun shook his head. "Already had my fill of coffee this morning. Going to head to the commissary and get some iced tea. Much better for the afternoons." "Right," Vrabel said. "What can I do for you?" The engineer's grin faded into a thin line. Vrabel could tell the man was about to say something unpleasant, or something he thought Vrabel might object to. "With your permission," he said, "Catfish would like to send another AUV out. We need to see if we can clear up some topographic anomalies." Vrabel's stomach filled with acid. He'd known this was going to come up, or hoped it would. Now it was time to lower the boom. "Considering an AUV was launched this morning, without my knowledge, I assume you're talking about another one?" Calhoun blinked. A sheepish grin filled his face. "You were sleeping. Catfish and JP decided not to wait." The coffee machine burped one last gout of steam and Vrabel pulled out the mug. His eyes bore into Calhoun's. "I thought we had this conversation and that you agreed there wouldn't be any more cowboy shit." "We had. We did. We do," Calhoun said, "but this is important." Vrabel sipped the black liquid. His tongue burned, but he didn't care. "I'm sure it is. But we have procedures for a reason, Calhoun, and your boys have to follow it." "Agreed," Calhoun said after a pause. He rubbed a hand through his thinning hair. "And I'll make sure—" "I'm getting tired of you saying you'll make sure and then not doing it, Calhoun." Vrabel's easy grin disappeared. "So do me a favor. Stop talking. Start doing. I don't want anyone injured on this rig. Not my people," he said, pointing to himself. "And not yours." His index finger stabbed in Calhoun's direction. "And I will go to Simpson if this shit continues." Calhoun chewed his lower lip and sighed. "Understood." "Bullshit," Vrabel said. "Stop grin-fucking me and make it happen." The engineer's face flushed. Vrabel knew he'd just tweaked the man, and that wasn't a good idea, but fuck it. The asshole needed to know where he stood. "Just stay out of my team's way and I'll do my best to make it happen." Vrabel smiled. "Anything else?" "No," Calhoun said in a clipped voice. "I think we understand one another." Vrabel nodded to the man. Then, if you don't mind, I have reports to read." Calhoun turned on his heel and lumbered out the hatch. Vrabel let out a deep breath, his body tingling with stress. Since Simpson thought Calhoun was a god, pissing the guy off could be bad. Vrabel could have been more diplomatic about the AUV bullshit, but it never seemed to end. Catfish's pet project was out of control, and Vrabel was the only one that seemed to see that. Topographic anomalies? My pimpled ass, he thought. Catfish just wanted to play with his toys. He walked back to the captain's chair and rested the coffee mug on the console. Reports to read, reports to study, reports to double-check. It was going to be a damned long afternoon. He shoved thoughts of Calhoun and Catfish out of his mind and began to read.